The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
So you may have heard this story before, especially if you have children or grandchildren in a preschool program or early elementary school, because it's one that you're likely to find there. One day, a little boy had gone through his puzzles, was tired of building with his blocks, and was driving his mother crazy, asking her, "What can I do? What can I do?" And finally, he wore the mother down. She sighed. She said, "All right, I have a task for you. You need to go and find a little red house with no doors, no windows, a chimney, and a star inside." "Oh, Mom, where am I going to find anything like that?" She said, "You are telling me how bored you are. You've done everything that you wanted to do in this house, and unless you want to start helping with the dishes and sweep the floor, you need to go find that little red house with no doors, no windows, a chimney, and a star inside." Okay, so off he went down the road, not knowing really what to expect. It was a kind of a breezy day, and he's kicking the dirt under his feet as he goes along, and he came to his neighbor, a little girl. He thought, well, maybe she would know. So he asked his little friend, "Hi." And she greeted him back, "Hi. I'm looking for something." "Well, what are you looking for? Maybe I've got it." Well, his eyes and ears perked up at that. Maybe she did. "I'm looking for a little red house with no doors, no windows, a chimney, and a star inside." The little girl thought. She looked around her yard. She thought what was in her toy chest. "I don't have anything like that," she said. "Sorry." "Well, that's okay. Thanks for thinking about it." And off he went down the road, taking a stick, dragging it in the sand as he went along, till he came to the farmer. Now, farmers know a lot. They work 7 days a week. They're looking out in the world at what's going on all the time. Maybe this farmer would know. So he went up to the farmer and he said, "Good morning, farmer." "Good morning, boy. How are you doing today?" "I'm trying to find something." "But what are you trying to find?" "I'm trying to find a little red house with no doors, no windows, a chimney, and a star inside." Well, farmer pushed his hat back on his head, scratched his head, thought about it. That's red, but it has doors. Well, that has doors, but I'm sorry, little fella. I don't think I can help you today." "Okay, thank you. Why don't you go down the road and ask Granny? She's out on the porch this morning. I saw her out there, and maybe she can help you out." So he went skipping down the road, thinking maybe Granny could help him. And he skipped and whistled along until he came to Granny, and there she was sitting on the porch. She went up the path to the steps. "Good morning, Granny." "Eh? Good morning, Granny." "Oh, good morning, Sonny. Can I help you today?" "Yes, Granny, you can," he said as loud as he could. "Well, that's good. I'm happy to help." And her little face was as wizened and wrinkled as a walnut, and you knew she had years and years of wisdom in her head and in her heart. So the little boy looked at her and said, "I'm trying to find a little red house with no doors, no windows, a chimney, and a star inside." Granny pondered that over. She looked this way. She looked that way. She closed her eyes and thought deep into her memories. I don't know, little boy, but I have an idea. I think that if you follow the wind across the way to the orchard, the wind can help you out. The wind? Okay, Granny, he said. And off he went down the path and across the road and into the orchard. And the wind was blowing. And when the wind blows, you know, the leaves get ruffled. And he said to the wind, "Wind, do you know where I can find a little red..." Plop. Off of that apple tree fell a red apple. She thinks the wind might know the answer. The wind knocked this apple down and he picked it up. Well, it was little, it was red. It had no doors. It had no windows. The stem could be a chimney. But I don't know if there's a star inside. Well, stuck the apple in his pocket and made a beeline for back home. Mom, Mom, Mom! Oh, you're back. Mom, I think I found it. I think I found it. Found what? Mom! Oh, okay. Mom, I found it. It's a little red house with no doors, no windows, a chimney, but I don't know if there's a star inside. I know, said the mother. She took the apple, polished it up, set it on a plate, grabbed a knife, took the stem so it was laying on its side, and she cut the apple in half and opened it up and showed him the two halves of the apple. And inside, there was a star on each side. And that's the story of the little boy with the little red house.
This is a story that that came to me from M.L. Jagendorf's folklore collection called Upstate, Downstate. And however, it was set in there in Ballston Spa. And when I started telling this story, I told it a lot in schools around Ballston Spa and in libraries, and trying to find somebody who knew this story. And I finally found Irene Melander, who was a librarian in one of the Ballston Spa elementary schools, who told me, "Oh yes, my uncle told me that story, and he knows right where that cabin was." And of course, her uncle was probably a great storyteller.
Well, she remembered the story, so I think it goes without saying.
So, shall I tell the story?
Please do.
Okay, all right. Now, should I look here more than here?
Yes, that's your camera.
Okay, all right. Well, once there was a guy named Pete. Now, Pete lived, depending on where you want to tell this story, but according to M.L. Jagendorf's version, he lived not too far outside of Ballston Spa. Now, a lot of you probably know that Ballston Spa preceded Saratoga Springs as the town where people went to take the waters. So Pete was just a guy who got work wherever he could. And in the summer, when all those fancy folks from New York and Boston came to Ballston Spa, to Saratoga, to the Adirondacks, Pete would get work in one of the hotels as a cook. He was a good cook. He was also a good Adirondack guide, so he would take people fishing and hunting. But the thing Pete loved the most was playing his fiddle. And although there are a lot of fine fiddlers today that can make their living from that, Pete wasn't able to do that. When the fancy folks would go away, he would help people get in their wood, or he would help them press cider or pick apples. And he loved playing his fiddle. So this is a perfect time for you to bring up this story, because when all those fancy folks went home and the harvest came, that's when Pete got a lot of work playing his fiddle. Because once the harvest was brought in, people would go to a grange hall, or they would roll up the carpet in their own living room and have a dance, a celebration of the harvest. So, one of the cool, crisp, first starlit, no moon nights, cold nights, maybe it was September, maybe it was October, Pete had a dance to play at. It was a Friday night. He had a dance to play at, and as he went out the door, he recognized how cold it was. He came back in and he grabbed a hat that had ear flaps that he'd never put away, but he didn't see any gloves. He had his fiddle, of course, wrapped in sheepskin. He put that under his arm, put his hands in his pockets, and headed off to the dance. And he played and he played and he played for as long as anybody wanted to dance. And when he started home, he thought he'd take a shortcut through the woods. And he hadn't gotten much out of the gas lamps of Ballston Spa when underneath the ear flaps of that cap, he heard a sound that he didn't like very much. And he lifted up one of the ear flaps with the hand that wasn't in his pocket holding his fiddle. He tried to say, "Oh, it's just dogs. It's just dogs." But Pete was a guide, and he knew it was not dogs. It was wolves howling in the woods. Now, Pete knows as well as you do, and I hope you do, what the last thing you should ever do is if you meet a wild animal.
Yell at them?
Run. Because what does your dog do when you start to run? Your dog chases you. So Pete said to himself, although those wolf howls were making the hair stand up on the back of his neck, he said to himself, "Don't run. Don't run. Don't run. Don't run. Don't run. Don't run. Don't run." And he was running down that path. Well, those wolves probably didn't even know Pete was around. But when he started banging against the bushes and running down that path, now they were truly after him. And the next time Pete turned to look around behind him, he was sure that he could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wolves coming down that path. He saw their eyes, he was sure. And he said, "Oh, those wolves are going to outrun me. I'm never going to get home." But right around this corner, there's an old cabin. Nobody had been there forever. Maybe I can hide in there. And indeed, he knew those woods so well. He went around that corner, and there was that old cabin. He ran up on the steps, and nobody had been in there for a long time, so there were a lot of leaves and sticks against the door. And when he pressed on the latch to open the door, there was no lock. He pushed the door open, and he went in, and he tried to close that latch behind him against the wolves, but all the leaves and sticks, they got into the hinge side of that door, and he tried to pull them out, but he could hear they were getting closer and closer. So he gave up unlatching the door, and he just looked around in that cabin to see where he could hide. He was hoping that there would be at least some shelves that had maybe doors on them, or maybe, if nothing else, cloth hanging down, or an old wardrobe that somebody had left in there, put their clothes. Nothing. There was nothing but the post and the beam that held that cabin up. Now, adrenaline is a wonderful thing. Pete could never tell how he did this afterwards, but he shot right up that post, and still, when he pulled himself up on the beam, he still had that one hand in his pocket with the fiddle wrapped in sheepskin. he got up on that beam just in time because those 6 wolves, they hit that door and all 6 of them came to surround that post, and they started leaping and jumping. Now, I didn't tell you, but Pete was a long, tall, skinny guy. And even though he was up on that beam, his long, skinny legs were hanging down. And it looked to him like the biggest one of those wolves, kind of climbing up on the backs of the others, was about to grab his pants leg. So he pulled his long, skinny legs up on that beam. At first, if you looked at him, if you can see him there, he would have looked like a big M with his head just looking out over his knees. Those wolves, oh, how they were leaping. Their wolf breath was coming up in the air toward Pete. Oh, he said, I wish I'd brought my gun to the dance. But of course, even if the fiddler is well known, he's not going to be let in if he has his shotgun. Pete teetered up there, and then he thought, well, the human folks like my music. Maybe the wolves will too. And so instead of sitting like an M, he kind of made himself like a pretzel. He crossed his legs on that beam and then started to pull his fiddle out from under his arm. His hands were shaking so much that sheepskin, not his fiddle or his bow, thank heavens, the sheepskin slipped out of his hands and went right down into the middle of those wolves. And in a second, that sheepskin was shredded by those wolves, and little pieces of wool were floating up toward Pete, sitting on that beam. Oh, he said, little pieces of Pete gonna be floating in the air. And with that thought, he put his fiddle under his chin and he began to play the first thing that came into his mind. It was Turkey in the Straw. Oh, thank heavens the wolves don't know these words. The wolves stopped leaping, howling, jumping, and just stood there on all fours, looking at Pete the way your dog maybe does when you do something funny that they've never seen you do, turning their heads one way and then another, and meanwhile, well, Pete went on to the next song, which was Yankee Doodle. Now, that might have made the wolves march around. I mean, if they were patriotic like we are when we hear Yankee Doodle marching around, they sat down. Their legs in front of them. So Pete went right on to Old Joe Clark. Now, you may not know that, and I guess the wolves didn't know it either, but still, they spread their paws straight out and put their chins on their paws. Pete had tamed those wolves, and he thought that that's how he would get through the night, and he did. He played one song after another on that fiddle until the gray light began to come in through the chinks in that cabin wall. Now you know that gray light of dawn is the coldest time of the night, the time that's been without the light of the sun for the longest time. And I don't know if it was because Pete's fiddle strings got too cold or if they were too hot from his playing on them all night long, but all of a sudden, spring! One of Pete's fiddle strings snapped. Now, Pete was such a good fiddler that there was hardly a pause. He went right on. He could play almost as well on 3 strings But the wolves, the spell was broken by that spring. They stood up. And then, spring-a-ling! The second string broke. And then the wolves began to circle around, and when spring-a-ling, the third string broke. Those wolves were leaping and howling and reaching. And you might not have ever been able to hear this story because Pete might not have been around to tell it. Had not he had a job. Early that Saturday morning, folks were waiting for Pete to come and help them bring in their last load of wood. And finally, they'd said, "Oh, you know, that old fiddler. He probably stayed too long at the dance tonight. We can't wait any longer." And they got in their wagons and they headed off toward their woodlot, which brought them along the edge of the woods, where they heard a sound. Wolves howling in the morning? They knew something was amiss. And so they got out of their wagon and they had their shotguns and they started firing them into the air and following, "Oh, this is the path to that old cabin." Well, firing their shotguns in the air, they saw all 6 of those wolves shoot out that cabin door and disappear. And when they walked up and pushed open that door, there was Pete, just stretching out his legs for the first time all night long. Well, they helped Pete down, and there was no wood for Pete that day because he had a dance to play at that Saturday night. He went home for some rest. And when he got up that night, oh, he looked at his shotgun, how he wanted to take that with him. But he knew he couldn't get into the dance, so he went to a drawer and he pulled out the next best thing to protect him in case he met those wolves again. You might know what Pete put in his pocket. If we were really here together, you might shout out some of those answers. And some of you probably know that Pete put an extra set of fiddle strings in his pocket. So I'm telling you, if you're lucky enough to get to the first Clifton Park Contra, where George Wilson, one of our finest Adirondack fiddlers, will have already played by the time you hear this, or you hear John Kirk or Ed Lauman, you go up to them in the break and you say, "Excuse me," and point to their fiddle cases. "Do you have an extra set of fiddle strings in there?" And if they say no, you better tell them about Pete, because we've reintroduced wolves in the Adirondacks.
But long ago, before even horses came to the continent, but when the Lakota people were still hunting buffalo, there was a young man who became very interested in a young woman in his tribe. But she didn't seem to be interested in meeting him. In fact, many men had expressed an interest in talking with her, being with her, and she didn't want to have anything to do with any of them. And this young man was rather shy anyway, so that made it even more difficult for him. Well, to take his mind off of this beautiful young woman, he decided to go hunting. After all, you could always use meat and the fur from an animal. And as he packed what he would need to be out for a little bit, he set off and came across the tracks of an elk. This was a hopeful sign, so soon to run into the tracks of an elk. So he followed the tracks along. He followed it all over the level place and up into the hills and down into the valleys and deeper into the woods. Now occasionally he would get a quick glimpse of that elk, But never was he in a position where he could take a clear shot at it. It always seemed to disappear. And before he knew it, the day was gone and night was upon him. So he had to spend the night out in the forest, but that wasn't unusual for him to have to do that. So he made a bed of leaves and pine needles the best he could and curled up on that cold night. And he listened to the night sounds to try to take his mind off of the cold and off of the hardness of the ground. He could hear the owls hooting in the different distance. And of course, he knew which kind of owl was which. And he could hear the leaves rustling as the little animals came out in the night and made their way along. And he was just about to drift off to sleep when he heard a sound that was, well, it wasn't singing, but it was beautiful, like singing. That he'd never heard before? No, it didn't really sound like any bird, none that he'd heard. And as the night got quieter and the wind died down, he drifted off to sleep. When in the morning, when he woke up, the sun was 2 hands above the horizon. That was late for him to be waking up. But he realized right there in front of him was a woodpecker. And the woodpecker was tapping on the tree. Well, woodpeckers didn't usually get that close. He stood up, stretched, and put his bow on his shoulder and collected his belongings, and the woodpecker stayed. And as he started to walk away, the woodpecker flew with him. And then the woodpecker went in a different direction, and he realized the woodpecker was calling to him. The woodpecker, his brother, was trying to tell him something important. He thought about getting back to the village and getting some food, but he realized he must be on some kind of a mission, and he followed the woodpecker through the woods, and they really didn't have to go too far till they came to a dead tree. Now, when most of us look at trees, we say, oh, that's a lovely tree because it has beautiful spreading branches and lots of leaves that are green or in the fall maybe colored. Or maybe the tree has beautiful green, long pine needles, or maybe short green needles. This tree had long ago lost most of its branches and all of its leaves. But there were some branches sticking out, and there were holes in the branches, holes that probably Brother Woodpecker had pecked. And then the wind came up. And he heard that sound again. This was it, the source of the beautiful song. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't people singing. It was the wind coming through this piece of wood. He climbed up the tree and managed to break off that branch with the holes in it. And he spent the day trying to make that sound again. And he held it up for the wind, and he ran with it, and he blew on it, but nothing he could do could get that beautiful sound again. It was disappointing because that sound was so lovely. He knew that all his people would want to hear it too. Well, he stayed away from the village for 4 days. He didn't eat. He walked and he fasted. And on the 4th night, he laid down to sleep. And that night, the woodpecker came to him in his dreams. And in that dream, the woodpecker showed him what he needed to do to that piece of wood, to a piece of wood. He woke up in the morning completely inspired, and he went and got a branch, and he hollowed out the center of it, and that took some patience. And the end of it had to look like the open mouth of a bird. And then he made little holes along the branch. And then he took it and he held it to his mouth and he blew. And sounds came out. And he moved his fingers over the holes and more sounds came out. And he practiced it until he decided that it was worthy for other people to hear, that maybe they would hear the beauty like he heard that night when the wind blew the branch. It was night when he made his way back to where the teepees were. And he went to the teepee where that beautiful young girl lived. And he stood a little ways away, and he began to play his flute. And it was a beautiful, sweet song. Really, a song with an invitation to come. Come. The tent flapped open, and out she came. She saw him standing there in the night with his blanket wrapped around him, playing. He knew she was there, but he didn't look. He didn't want to make her do anything she didn't want to do. She came toward him with a very soft, sweet smile on her face. She lifted the robe off of his shoulder, wrapped it around her, and stood next to him while he continued to play. And that's how we came to have the first flute, and that's how this young man and this young woman came to be man and wife. The end.
And this story is about Jean Robert Foster's father, but she talks sometimes in this story as if she's talking to him when he's still a boy. Francie Oliver ran the farm while his father lumbered to support the 5 children he'd fathered and the wife he'd married who was from down below and didn't work like the other farm women. Now, Francie was the oldest of those 5, and by the time he was 12, he could plan the crops and plant like a grown man. But there never was enough. Francie's father wasn't thrifty. And so Francie turned drover. In the summer, he would drive cattle from Landon Hill Road, where he lived, down to Glens Falls to market, walking the 31 miles there and back. Now, he had to walk slowly because he had to bring the cattle to the market in as good shape as they were when they left Landon Hill. He had to stop to let them drink and graze along the way. And then once he got there, he would collect the prices and walk back to Landon Hill. Now this went on all summer. Francie would take the dry cows, the steers, the yearlings, whatever the farmers in his part of the country wanted to take to the market. I said, "Didn't you get tired and hungry?" "Oh, yes," he said, but I get paid for driving. I get something I can put in my pocket. I get paid. And besides, when I get to Chestertown, I always stop at Remington's store, and I buy some Jackson balls. I know just how many it takes to get me to Glens Falls and how many it takes to get me back home. Not as many when I'm coming back because I don't have the cattle and I can walk faster. Did you ever see a Jackson ball? Well, they're round, hard balls of peppermint candy. They're white with a red stripe going all around the outside. And they're so hard that they last a long time on the tongue. I never drive over Landon Hill Road, but I see in my mind's eye that shabby 12-year-old keeping the cattle in line for the long walk. And I remember those Jackson balls, just a few pennies worth, to keep him going on the trip. And his measuring the miles by their lasting. That's Jean Robert Foster's Jackson Balls.
So this is how we got butterflies, and this is from the Papago tribe in the Southwest. So, now I've forgotten what the name of the being was that was there. But it was just, he was out walking, and it was just after the rain, so the grass was green, the flowers were growing, the leaves were out on the trees, and the children were dancing and playing, and it was so beautiful, and he felt it and he smelt it, and it was just one of those glorious days that just, you take in with all your pores. And suddenly he was struck with a sadness because the day would be over and this feeling might be gone. And as he walked along, some yellow leaves danced up with the wind. And he walked along and he realized more yellow leaves were dancing up with the wind. But then when the wind died down, they were gone too. He thought, well, maybe I could create something that would remind me of this day and dance in the wind like those leaves did, but we wouldn't need the wind. So he took his sack and he went around and collected as many colors as he could. He collected the yellow cornmeal, or the yellow pollen and the white cornmeal. He collected green pine needles, pink petals from flowers, anything that had a beautiful color. He took and he put it in his bag. He took this bird's song and put that in his bag too. And he went and he called all those children who were out there playing, come, come. Well, when this great person in their family said to come, of course they ran over and wondered what was going on. And he said, I have something for you today, something that will make you remember when the rains have come and turned the grass green and the leaves green and brought the flowers to us. I think you will like it, but I'm not sure. And you won't need the wind to make it fly. And he opened the bag up, and out came orange and black butterflies, yellow and black butterflies, blue butterflies, yellow butterflies, all the butterflies with all the colors in the world that he had collected. And the children danced and jumped around as the butterflies fluttered among them. And they sang their beautiful songs. But the birds came along. They said, this is not right. You have given us the birds. And you gave us the song, and now you've given it to the butterflies. Well, he realized he had done the wrong thing to take the songs from the birds. He gave the songs back to the birds, but kept the beautiful butterflies that can dance in the wind or dance as if they were flying in the wind. The end.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round